There's a quiet moment that happens long after a connection fades, when a woman realizes the man she dismissed is no longer available to her, not emotionally, not energetically, not even in memory the way he once was. That moment is rarely dramatic. It's subtle. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that realization arrives so late. If this kind of emotional clarity matters to you, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Not as a favor to me, but as a commitment to understanding yourself and your relationships more deeply. Now, let me speak to you calmly and honestly, as someone who has listened to hundreds of women reflect on relationships they once underestimated. When a woman takes a man for granted, it's almost never because he lacked value. It's usually because his value was too consistent, too available, too quiet. Human perception doesn't measure worth objectively. It measures contrast. And when your presence becomes predictable, the nervous system stops registering it as something that could be lost. In the early stages, attention feels exciting because it's uncertain. But once stability sets in, the mind adapts. This isn't cruelty, it's psychology. The brain is wired to notice change, not constancy. So the man who shows up, communicates clearly, stays emotionally regulated, and doesn't threaten abandonment can slowly fade into the background of her emotional awareness. At this stage, many men misinterpret what's happening. They think effort needs to increase, so they give more, they explain more, they tolerate more. And without realizing it, they remove the very tension that allows appreciation to exist. From a female psychological perspective, appreciation is deeply tied to perceived emotional risk. When there is no risk of loss, the attachment system relaxes. The woman doesn't consciously think, "I can take him for granted." Instead, her nervous system assumes safety is guaranteed. And the mind, trying to optimize stimulation, begins to focus elsewhere, on novelty, challenge, or even imagined alternatives. This is where regret is quietly seated, not because she wants chaos, not because she doesn't value kindness, but because value, when not anchored by self-respect and boundaries, becomes invisible over time. Women often don't recognize this while they're inside it. Their emotional experience feels neutral, even justified. They may tell themselves the connection feels flat, that something is missing, that they're not inspired. What they don't realize is that what feels missing is often the presence of a man who knows when to step back rather than overextend. Regret doesn't form when she leaves. It forms later, when she notices the absence of emotional availability she once assumed would always be there. When she meets others who are exciting but inconsistent. When she realizes that peace is rare and safety with depth is even rarer. And here's the truth most men were never taught. Women don't regret losing men who tried harder. They regret losing men who knew their worth without needing to prove it. As we continue, I'll help you understand how that realization unfolds internally and why it almost never happens when you're still trying to be seen. When regret begins to surface, it doesn't arrive as longing right away. It begins as confusion. A subtle internal friction, a moment where something feels off, but the mind can't immediately name it. This is important to understand because many men imagine regret as a sudden emotional collapse. In reality, it's a slow psychological recalibration. After the connection ends, a woman often feels relief first. Relief from routine, relief from predictability, relief from a dynamic that no longer stimulated her emotionally. And this relief reinforces the belief that letting go was the right decision. The nervous system interprets change as movement, and movement can feel like growth, even when it's not. But then something quiet happens. The emotional environment shifts. She begins interacting with men who are inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, or performative with their attention. At first, this feels exciting. There's tension again, uncertainty, emotional spikes. But over time, those spikes come with instability. The nervous system stays activated. The emotional baseline never settles. And this is where memory changes. The man she once took for granted begins to reappear in her mind, not as he actually was in the relationship, but as a contrast to what she is now experiencing. Psychology calls this comparative recall. The mind doesn't retrieve memories objectively. It retrieves them relationally. She starts remembering how calm she felt around him, how conversations didn't feel like performances, how she didn't have to decode mixed signals or manage emotional unpredictability. These memories aren't romantic at first, they're stabilizing, and stability once lost becomes noticeable. This is when regret begins to form, not because she suddenly idealizes him, but because her nervous system recognizes what it no longer has access to. Another critical factor here is delayed appreciation. Appreciation often requires distance. When someone is present and consistent, their value blends into the emotional background. But when they're gone and no longer reachable, that value becomes defined by absence. This is especially true when the man didn't beg, chase, or emotionally collapse after the relationship ended. A clean withdrawal creates psychological finality. There's no ongoing reassurance that access is still possible, and without access, the mind is forced to confront reality instead of expectation. Many women later describe this as a moment of clarity. Not dramatic, not obsessive, just a quiet understanding that something solid was mishandled. What's important for you as a man is to understand that this process has nothing to do with manipulation or strategy. It's not about playing games or withholding affection to create desire. It's about emotional self-containment. Men who are grounded, self-directed, and internally validated don't disappear loudly. They disappear cleanly. And that kind of disappearance lingers psychologically because it signals self-respect rather than rejection. Regret grows in the space where certainty once lived. And this is the part most men misunderstand. The regret isn't about losing attention. It's about losing access to a version of themselves that only existed in the presence of a man who was emotionally stable and grounded. She doesn't just miss him, she misses who she was when she felt safe without effort, and that realization changes how she interprets the past, long after the opportunity to return has passed. Is this conversation helpful so far? As regret deepens, it becomes less about the relationship itself and more about self-reflection. This is the phase where the mind turns inward, not in a dramatic or emotional way, but in a sobering adult way. The question is no longer, why didn't he do more? It quietly becomes, why didn't I see what was already there? This shift happens when emotional patterns repeat. She notices that new connections follow a familiar cycle: intensity, uncertainty, emotional highs, followed by disappointment or emotional distance. At some point, the pattern becomes undeniable, and the mind, seeking coherence, looks backward to compare. This is where the man who was taken for granted becomes psychologically distinct. He is no longer blended into the category of past relationships. He stands apart because the emotional tone of that connection was different, not louder, not more exciting, but regulated, safe, real. And this is crucial. Regret does not form around men who overextended themselves. It forms around men who were present without self-abandonment, men who didn't negotiate their worth for emotional closeness. When a man consistently prioritizes his values, boundaries, and direction in life, he creates an emotional anchor. Women may not consciously recognize the importance of that anchor while it's there, but once it's gone, the emotional system feels unmoored. This realization often comes with discomfort, because regret isn't just sadness, it's accountability. It's the awareness that the loss wasn't caused by bad luck or timing, but by misperception. And misperception is harder to accept than betrayal or incompatibility. It forces the mind to acknowledge that something valuable was overlooked, not because it was hidden, but because it felt too stable to demand attention. Many women, when reflecting honestly, describe this stage as humbling, not humiliating, humbling. It strips away narratives and replaces them with clarity. And clarity has weight. Here's something men are rarely told. Emotional maturity in women develops through consequence, not intention. Most people don't learn to value depth by being told to. They learn by losing it. This doesn't mean she becomes consumed by regret or tries to return. Often, she doesn't. Instead, The lesson integrates quietly into her future choices. She becomes more attuned to consistency, less dismissive of calm, more discerning about what feels boring versus what feels emotionally safe. And that's why regret often stays unspoken. Not because it isn't real, but because it arrives after growth, not during chaos. By the time she fully understands what she lost, she also understands that revisiting it would be unfair to him and to herself. The man who was taken for granted becomes a reference point, not a fantasy, a standard. And while men sometimes hope regret means reconciliation, psychologically, it more often means respect. A reclassification of value that arrives too late to change the outcome. What matters most for you is not whether she regrets losing you, but whether you lived in alignment with your self-respect while you were there. Because the men who are remembered with clarity are not the ones who demanded appreciation. They are the ones whose absence taught it. At this stage, regret no longer lives in emotion alone. It moves into belief. It reshapes how a woman understands relationships, attraction, and herself. And this is where the impact of being taken for granted becomes most profound, not just for her, but for the kind of men she chooses afterward. When a woman reflects on a man she underestimated, she often realizes that what she labeled as too predictable was actually emotional reliability. What felt uninspiring was often emotional safety without drama. And what she interpreted as a lack of spark was frequently the absence of anxiety she had unconsciously learned to associate with attraction. This is not a failure of character. It's conditioning. Many women grow up internalizing the idea that emotional intensity equals connection, that chemistry must feel activating, that calm equals complacency. But over time, and often through loss, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. It learns that peace doesn't mean lack of depth, it means regulation. And when that shift happens, regret becomes educational. She begins to notice how rare it is to find a man who communicates directly, listens without defensiveness, and doesn't require emotional labor to maintain connection. She recognizes that consistency is not common, and that when it exists, it should be protected, not tested. But here's a truth that matters for you. This realization doesn't happen because a man waited around. It happens because he didn't. The absence of negotiation is what gives the lesson weight. When a man continues to offer access after being undervalued, the mind never fully confronts the loss. Availability dilutes consequence. Boundaries sharpen it. From a psychological standpoint, regret requires finality, not punishment, not hostility, just closure that cannot be bypassed. This is why women rarely regret men who stayed emotionally entangled after the relationship ended. Continued emotional presence creates a sense of unfinished business rather than loss. It keeps the attachment system activated in confusion rather than reflection. In contrast, when a man exits with dignity, without bitterness, without pleading, without emotional withdrawal as a tactic, it creates a clean emotional break. And that clean break allows insight to form. Another important layer here is identity contrast. She remembers who she was in that relationship, how she showed up, how she felt. And when her current experiences don't match that internal sense of stability, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Regret then becomes less about missing him and more about missing alignment. Alignment with someone who didn't require performance. Alignment with a dynamic that didn't demand constant evaluation. This is where many women quietly upgrade their internal standards. They stop confusing intensity with intimacy. They stop dismissing steadiness as boring. And they become more careful with men who offer emotional safety without chasing validation. And yet, this growth often arrives too late to benefit the man who inspired it. Because the men who teach these lessons are not usually present to witness the outcome. They've moved on, not in resentment, but in self-respect. And that's the quiet irony of being taken for granted. The value becomes clear only once it's no longer accessible. Not because it was withheld, but because it was no longer offered. By the time regret fully settles, it has changed form. It is no longer emotional or reflective, it becomes integrated wisdom. This is the stage where the experience stops hurting and starts informing future behavior. And paradoxically, this is also the stage where reconciliation becomes least likely. When a woman reaches this level of understanding, she often sees the past without distortion. The man she took for granted is no longer idealized or minimized. He is understood accurately. His consistency, his patience, his boundaries, his emotional steadiness, and most importantly, his decision to stop offering what was not being valued. At this point, regret doesn't feel like longing. It feels like recognition. Recognition that emotional maturity is quiet. Recognition that depth doesn't demand chaos. Recognition that attraction built on safety lasts longer than attraction built on tension. But this recognition comes with acceptance. Acceptance that the moment has passed. From a psychological perspective, people rarely attempt to return to relationships that taught them something foundational. Those relationships become symbolic. They represent a turning point rather than an opportunity. Revisiting them would blur the lesson. This is why many men never hear the words, "I regret losing you," even when the feeling exists. The regret lives internally, not as a request for another chance. Expressing it would disrupt the meaning it has already taken on. For you as a man, this is not something to wait for or hope for. It's something to understand. Because your power was never in being missed. It was in being solid. Men who are taken for granted often mistake silence for insignificance. But silence after a clean ending usually means processing, not indifference. Emotional digestion takes time, and real lessons don't announce themselves. Another important truth: regret doesn't elevate the past relationship. It elevates the standard going forward. The woman becomes more discerning, less reactive, more aware of what consistency looks like in action. And this is where many men misunderstand female psychology. They think regret means she realizes she should have tried harder with him. What it actually means is she realizes she should have recognized value sooner, anywhere. The man she lost becomes the reference point against which future men are measured. Not in comparison, but in principle. Does this man respect himself? Does he communicate clearly? Does he remain emotionally grounded even when things are uncertain? These questions weren't fully formed before. Now they are. And while this growth may never benefit the man who inspired it, it doesn't erase his impact. It confirms it. The deepest influence is often invisible. And the most meaningful relationships are not always the ones that last, but the ones that rewire perception. So if you were ever taken for granted, understand this. Your value was not missed because it was small. It was missed because it was stable. And stability is often only recognized after it's gone. There is a final psychological layer to regret that few people talk about, and it's the one that brings everything into focus. This is where the lesson stops being about relationships and becomes about self-perception. This is where a woman no longer asks what kind of man she wants, but what kind of emotional patterns she has been living inside. When a woman fully understands that she took a grounded man for granted, she often confronts something uncomfortable. Her attraction wasn't broken, but it was conditioned. Conditioned to equate emotional unpredictability with depth. Conditioned to feel alive only when something felt uncertain. And conditioned to undervalue peace because peace didn't activate urgency. This realization doesn't come with guilt, it comes with maturity. She begins to see that the man she lost didn't fail to excite her. He failed to trigger her old emotional patterns. And those patterns, once examined honestly, are rarely something she wants to keep repeating. This is where regret transforms into responsibility. Not responsibility toward him, but responsibility toward her future self. She understands that taking a man for granted wasn't about him being insufficient. It was about her not yet being ready to recognize calm as connection. And readiness is not something you can force. It only arrives through lived experience. What's important for you to understand is this. You were not a lesson because you lacked edge or intensity. You were a lesson because you represented emotional adulthood in a world that often rewards emotional chaos. Men who carry themselves with quiet confidence, emotional consistency, and internal direction often feel overlooked early in life. But psychologically, they leave deeper imprints, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. This is also why regret doesn't always lead to contact. Reaching out would require reopening a chapter that now serves a purpose as a closed reference point. It would risk turning insight into confusion. Many women intuitively avoid that, not out of pride, but out of respect for the clarity they've gained. And this is where your role becomes clear. You were never meant to wait to be appreciated. You were meant to move forward unchanged. Men who grow bitter after being taken for granted misunderstand the outcome. The real outcome isn't validation, it's confirmation. Confirmation that your way of being had substance, that it created contrast strong enough to teach something lasting. This doesn't mean you were perfect, it means you were anchored. And anchored men are often recognized late, but remembered clearly. If there's one truth to carry with you, it's this: you don't need to become more intense, more distant, or more performative to be valued. You need to remain aligned with who you are and allow life to sort out who can recognize it in time. Because the men women regret losing are not the ones who demanded to be seen. They are the ones who knew when to walk away without losing themselves. Everything you've heard so far leads to a quiet but powerful conclusion, one that most men never reach because they're taught to measure worth by response, attention, or validation. But real value is revealed differently. It's revealed in what changes after you leave. When a woman regrets taking a man for granted, the regret isn't loud. It doesn't show up as dramatic messages or sudden confessions. It shows up as a recalibration of her internal compass. Her sense of attraction matures. Her tolerance for emotional instability shrinks. Her respect for grounded masculinity increases. And that shift matters, even if you never witness it, because the impact you had was not transactional. It wasn't dependent on reward. It existed because you embodied something rare: emotional steadiness without control, strength without dominance, presence without self-erasure. Most men are taught that if they aren't chosen, they failed. Psychology tells a different story. Sometimes you aren't chosen because the other person hasn't yet developed the perception required to recognize what you offer, and perception always lags behind experience. This is why the men who are taken for granted early often become the men who are deeply valued later by someone else at the right stage of life. Not because they changed who they were, but because they stayed consistent while the world caught up. If you've ever questioned your worth because someone didn't fully see you, let this settle deeply. Your value was never dependent on her awareness. It was inherent in how you showed up, with integrity, with restraint, with self-respect. Regret doesn't mean she wants you back. It means she understands you. And understanding, when it arrives late, becomes wisdom rather than desire. For you, the task is simple, but not easy. Don't internalize being overlooked as inadequacy. Don't chase appreciation from people who can't yet perceive stability as strength. And don't shrink your emotional maturity to appear more stimulating. The men who leave a lasting psychological imprint are not the ones who burn brightly and disappear. They are the ones whose absence creates clarity. So if you are taken for granted, don't ask when regret will come. Ask whether you're still living in alignment with your values. Because the man who walks forward with self-respect doesn't need to be remembered loudly. He is remembered accurately. And that kind of remembrance shapes lives, quietly, permanently, and long after he's gone.